what I didn't know and my normal. We've been going through the 8 reasons why I found myself in a domestic abuse situation and wasn't even aware of it. I was married for 22 years and it was very destructive and not good for me, and I ended up in the psych ward twice before I realized something was up. So this is all about the reasons why I missed it. So today we're going to talk about my normal and not having the words to even describe what I was going through. And without the words to describe it, it made it very hard to understand it. Let's first talk about number 1, my normal. So whatever we're in for a while, we just create as normal, whether it's our childhood situation and that was the environment we grew up in, or whether as adults we're in situations, we become acclimated to whatever we're going through, and that becomes our normal. So it really wasn't until I had a friend that was being emotionally and physically abused, and she was telling me about it, which was a surprise because I had known her for 2 years and had really no idea of this. And she was saying that she was chronically in fear, and I thought, well, that's strange, so am I. And let me just say, red flag, if you're in fear all the time in a relationship, that's a red flag. And that's something you need to delve into a little bit more and figure out why. And so that was just my normal, as I was always in fear, always walking on eggshells. And I had just gotten used to it and didn't even question it. So it's a great thing to question your normal and really see, like, is this really healthy? Is this really a good thing? And really look into that a little bit more. Another thing about my normal is I would just compare myself to others. I would say, oh my goodness, he's such a great guy. He's a great provider. And if I was somebody else, I wouldn't be so affected about being stonewalled and ignored for 6 days and not being able to talk about any conflict without like being ignored for long periods of time. Another person may not have had a problem with that. Unfortunately, I was the one in the relationship, and it was very destructive to me to constantly being ignored and being shut out on a regular basis for, bringing up anything that might cause potential challenging feelings. I did a lot of self-shaming, like, gosh, somebody else could handle this, and I just did some self-shaming, and that was just a way to put up with my normal, and that wasn't okay either. So let's talk about the vocabulary that I didn't have at the time that would have really helped me. Because remember, this is all about, we're all talking about kind girls, and that's what I would have described myself and still describe myself. But as a kind girl, I was more interested in thoughts and feelings of others. I was taking care of others, very compassionate, very caring, just a very easygoing individual. And so being in the relationship that I was in and being exposed to some challenging things that I didn't have words for really put me at a disadvantage. So first thing I'm going to talk about is high functioning codependency, because that was on my side of the street. So, and we talked about this before, being from a Christian background and this and that, you're taught to serve and love others and think of others more important than yourself. But the problem is a high functioning codependent is what I would have described myself as. I was, functioning, doing this, doing that, taking care of household, all of those things, but I was more interested in the thoughts, feelings, and emotions of my spouse and that relationship at my own expense on a regular basis. So basically, I tolerated bad behavior that ended up being very destructive to my mental, physical, emotional health, which led to the psych ward visits. Gaslighting. This is another great term to be aware of that we talked about in, I think, episode 1 or 2. And gaslighting is basically where the other person is questioning you to the point that you're basically, is a form of manipulation, psychological manipulation, where you're questioning your own sanity. Things like, I didn't say that. What are you talking about? Oh, you're too sensitive. Or, changing things up so it's manipulating. But gaslighting is what's happening on a continual basis, is a form of covert control. And that is a very interesting term. In my experience, I had gaslighting, and that was pretty easy because, as I mentioned, my previous spouse was Asperger-ish. And so he really didn't believe there were other perspectives. And so it was very easy to be gaslit because he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. No, that's not true. No. And it was just like, so he was so confident in that it's like, okay, what's going on? I started questioning my own reality. But that's, whether it's done on purpose or not on purpose, like in my case, it doesn't matter. Gaslighting has the same effect where your opinion, thoughts, feeling, experience is not honored or respected or even considered. And that's something to be aware of. Love bombing. Oh, this is a good one. It's basically where somebody is lavishly giving you what your heart desires, whether it's trips or presents or whatever. For me, my heart desire was just to be emotionally connected and have a great friendship. And so for me, the dating period, the 9-month dating period, basically love bombed. Beautiful conversations and connection and equality and respect and all those things. And then as soon as we got married, there was a complete switch. And I thought, gosh, if I just performed better or did this better, then I'd get back to that person that I knew when we were dating. But the truth is that was just a form of love bombing. And basically, it's very interesting to understand there's so many different forms. Love bombing can be something where the whole idea is to get them attached or get the person attached, and then there's a shift. Then you start seeing a shift in behavior and actions and how they're treating you. But by that time, you're in love, you're attached, and then it can create a cycle of abuse. So just watching out for love bombing and even knowing that term is very important. Narcissism. I think a lot of us have heard of narcissism, and we think of the braggadocious, self-absorbed person that's loud and it's all about them. Another term that's important to understand is there's different degrees of narcissism, whereas like probably, the worst form is, really narcissistic. But there's different forms of it, and there's also something called a covert narcissist. So they're not the braggadocious, da-da-da-da. They're the quiet, self-absorbed, focus on self, and look down on others, lack empathy, and don't see other points of view. And even though it's covert and quiet, it's very destructive in a relationship, and it's something to be aware of. So covert narcissism, and there's lots of great materials on narcissism. Passive aggressive. This is a really important thing, and we've all done it. It's basically where you're passively expressing your feelings rather than expressing them actively. Like, hey, that didn't really feel good. It's like I'm rolling your eyes, or it could be slamming a door. And I'm sure we've all done it, but it's indirect forms of communication, which passive aggressive is not a healthy form of communication because it is indirect, and therefore it's very difficult to have problem solving when there's indirect communication. But passive aggressive can be so much where you basically aren't having any direct communication and can't resolve anything, and it can be very destructive. So that's called passive aggressive. Stonewalling. And we talked before in a prior episode about the different forms of abuse, and there are so many different forms of abuse where it's financial, sexual, psychological, religious, and that's not one you hear about a lot. But boy, I think some churches are a beautiful place to allow, beautiful in a not good way, a place to allow for abusers to be there. Because some scripture can be twisted in order to basically justify abusive cycles. So there's lots of different forms, and one thing is called stonewalling. And stonewalling is basically where you're putting up a stone wall and not basically ignoring the person and not going to talk, resolve, whatever. And that was the form that I had to deal with more so, is just being stonewalled for long periods of time and then bring it up again. And what happens is, this is not uncommon, more in men, because it's easy for men to be emotionally overloaded and then they just like stonewall. And so that's something for us as females to be aware of. And that's why even like trying to talk with like low emotion and this and that, I tried all of those things, but I had a great stonewall. It was a very much more of a metal wall. But stonewalling is something to be aware of. And this brings up a book that is probably the best relationship book I've ever read. And I went through a period, just trying to understand things, reading different relationship books. Would you like to start your Live Brighter journey with some free printable affirmation? There's nothing like reminding yourself of God's truth about you. Click the link below. The book is called The 7 Principles of Making Marriage Work by John Gottman. And it was a book that was studying on relationships done in a love lab. So it was a lab book on relationships in a 20-year study. And they got to the point where John Gottman and his team could identify if a person was going to get divorced within it was 5 minutes and 92% accuracy. It was wild. And what he found out were that if you have the 4 horsemen in your relationship regularly, that is a sign of impending doom. And those 4 horsemen are really important to identify. It's criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. And so you think about how much criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling is going on in our relationship. And if that is a regular aspect, then it's something to be aware of, because those are things that actually can be fixed. A lot of them are used as improper or unhealthy ways to communicate and resolve conflict. And resolving conflict, I have to say, when, after I got divorced and when I was open to a new relationship, the most important thing that I wanted was somebody that was willing to have conflict, but in a healthy way, that we could resolve conflict and talk about it, and we could end up stronger, which if it's done right, that is exactly what happens. And so that was the most important thing for me. And I'm happy to say that my marriage with Michael is wonderful, because one thing you're never going to avoid is conflict in a relationship. It just happens when 2 people are living together. And so being able to talk about it and discuss things in a way that actually is problem solving and serves you both and brings you together is just super powerful. So another nice thing about the book by the Gottmans is that he talks also about what makes marriage work and wonderful. So it's not uncommon that I hand this book out because I'm a realtor and a life coach, and I'll hand this book out as a closing gift sometimes, if somebody's gotten divorced, because I just say, hey, to avoid a practice marriage or to find out really how to have a healthy marriage, this book is super helpful to me, and you might find some benefit to it. But it's probably the best book. Or I had a young man that hadn't been married, and I'm like, hey, if you want to know some really great keys to having a healthy relationship, here's this book, and it can save you from having a practice marriage. Cognitive dissonance. And that's basically where you have 2 opposing thoughts that you can't reconcile. And for me, that is actually what would put me, the 2 times I was in the psych ward, it was because of cognitive dissonance. So I'll talk about the second time. And basically I was like, okay, this guy says he loves me, but he's been bitter against me for 5 years and has been treating me horrible. And he says he loves me, and I could not bring those together at all. And so I would stop sleeping because I could not figure it out. And the truth is, people are different than us, and we won't be able to figure things out. But that cognitive dissonance is where you're just trying to have 2 belief systems and they're not going together. And that can be very upsetting. Trauma. Trauma is an overwhelming event that as a person, we do not have the ability to handle. Trauma is basically where our coping skills are overwhelmed to the point that we just do not have the ability to cope. And what it does is it creates a very vivid imprint in our brain and affects us moving forward in many ways, and can cause things like PTSD or situations like that. And we talked about trauma before, because there's the trauma events, or there's just a regular traumas that eventually can play and wreak havoc in a person's life. So trauma is, that's such a big deal. Understanding traumas and healing those traumas, and we talked about that previously, is very powerful in healthy relationships and moving forward. Trauma bonding, or the Stockholm syndrome, is basically where the abused individual is attached to the abuser. And that's not uncommon, because there's that cycle of abuse. And remember, that cycle of abuse, it starts off with the honeymoon period, and then the tension builds up, and then there's an abusive episode or some sort of abuse, and then the abuser goes back to the honeymoon. So this cycle, and basically it creates this bond, and called trauma bonding, or Stockholm syndrome. And it's very interesting to see how our brain works, and being able to understand that is very helpful in healing. Attachment styles. How we give and receive comfort as children creates, with our parental figures, creates an attachment style. And attachment styles can very much affect relationships because basically it is very difficult to bond with a person unless you have low anxiety and you have the ability to give and receive comfort. And that's what creates a healthy bond in a relationship. But if there's high anxiety, that's going to be challenging. Or if there's not giving and receiving of comfort, then it's very difficult to bond in a marriage and to create that bonding. A great book on that is How We Love by Milan and Kay Yurkovich, and that is a sensational book on that. Boundaries. Wow. I don't think I even knew the word boundaries before my experience. And as a kind girl, I was just easygoing, kind. I didn't realize that I needed to have careful boundaries to protect my physical, psychological, mental, all of that well-being. I did not understand that. So a great book on that is Terry Cole's Boundary Boss. I also know that Townsend and Henry Cloud have done some really great books on that. So I had a group of gals, and I would say we all identified as kind girls, and we did the Boundary Boss book together. It was really transformative because as a whole, that's something that, first of all, we didn't even know that we were allowed to have boundaries, what they were, and how to use them in a healthy way. And then also learning about boundaries destroyers. And those are just people that have no thought, care, concern about your boundaries and regularly just go right past them. And that's really interesting to learn about. A high sensitive person or an empath. So it's a very interesting thing about me, and I didn't have the vocab for it, is that I could read a room and I could tell what people were going through and thoughts and feelings very easily. And I think I was just born a sensitive person. This can also happen in when you're a child and there's some challenges or abuse going on, because it's kind of important for your survival to read the room and identify what's going on to protect yourself. And it also, some people are just born more of this. And the challenging part of this is at the time I was married to someone who was highly Aspergerish. And so they really didn't believe in, they were completely he was completely disconnected with his emotions, but yet I could feel the emotions. So unfortunately, when he was having his 5 years of bitterness scenario, I could feel it and I could ask about it, but because he was completely saying, oh, no, I'm not, no, everything's great, then it was very confusing for me until he told me that it was true and that he was bitter for the last 5 years. So knowing that there are people like me that are highly sensitive and empath, and knowing how to use it in a healthy way is super important because it's really overwhelming. I'm more sensitive to lights, crowds, just because I can just pick up on so much information. It can be very challenging as far as focus. It can be very challenging as far as other things as well. And just learning how that works and how to handle that was life-changing for me. That was a lot of vocabulary, but for me, not having the vocabulary made it very hard to identify my experience or put it into words. So having this information can be important because either you can relate to some of this or you have a friend that can relate to some of these terms. And knowledge can be power in a lot of ways. We can't diagnose people, but we can work on our side of the street. You're not alone. We're all learning. It's nice to open your mind to some of this information and go research it some more. If you have any questions, leave them for me. Leave a 5-star review. If you want to know more information, you can go to livebrighter.info. I believe in you, so let your light shine brighter.